I'm still shaking as I type this, and I honestly don't know where else to turn. This happened yesterday, and I can't wrap my head around what kind of person does something like this. My mother died last Thursday after a 2-year battle with cancer. Anyone who's been through this knows how exhausting and emotional the whole process is. The hospital visits, the treatments that don't work, watching someone you love just fade away. My wife Cindy seemed supportive through everything, always encouraging me to spend time with Mom, telling me the kids understood why Daddy was gone so much. The funeral was scheduled for yesterday at 2 p.m. I woke up early because I couldn't sleep and decided to check our shared calendar to make sure I hadn't forgotten any family obligations for after the service. That's when I saw entries I'd never seen before. Appointments that had been hidden from my view, but were visible when I clicked on Cindy's individual calendar by mistake. Tuesday, storage unit pickup, kids' belongings. Wednesday, final apartment walkthrough, 3 p.m. Thursday, daycare transfer meeting, 11 a.m. Friday, school enrollment appointment, Thomas and Eden, 9 a.m. I sat there staring at my phone, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Storage unit, apartment walkthrough, school enrollment. All of this happening while I was planning my mother's funeral, all scheduled around when I'd be too distracted to notice. I started looking through more of her hidden calendar entries and found months of planning. Apartment hunting going back to January, meeting with a lawyer in February, even a consultation with a moving company 3 weeks ago. Everything carefully scheduled for when I was at the hospital or handling Mom's affairs. The really sick part was the timing. The apartment lease signing was scheduled for yesterday at 4 p.m. The moving truck was booked for today. She'd planned to take the kids and disappear while I was greeting mourners at my mother's funeral reception. I called the number for the apartment complex and asked about the lease under Cindy's name. They confirmed she'd put down a deposit and was scheduled to sign final paperwork that afternoon. When I asked about occupancy, they said she'd requested immediate move-in for herself and 2 children, ages 12 and 9. That's when I realized she wasn't just leaving me. She was taking Thomas and Eden and moving 3 states away to where her sister Reagan lives. No discussion, no custody arrangements, no forwarding address. Just gone. I confronted her while she was getting the kids ready for the funeral. Asked her directly what was happening at 4 p.m. yesterday. The look on her face when she realized I'd found her calendar was something I'll never forget. Not guilt or shame, just annoyance that her plan had been discovered. She tried to play it off at first, saying she'd been looking at options in case our marriage didn't work out, that it was just preparation. But when I mentioned the moving truck and the school enrollment appointments, she dropped the act completely. Cindy told me she'd been planning this for months because she was tired of my mom taking up so much of our time and resources. She said she'd tried to wait until after Mom died, but realized I'd probably want to keep handling the estate and affairs for weeks afterward. She decided it would be cleaner to make the move while I was emotionally compromised and focused on other things. The word cleaner is what really got to me. Like destroying our family was just a logistics problem she'd solved efficiently. When I asked her what she'd planned to tell the kids, she said she was going to explain after they were settled that Daddy had been too sad about Grandma to take proper care of them. So they needed to live with Mommy somewhere Daddy could visit when he felt better. She'd already told Thomas and Eden they were going on a surprise trip to see Aunt Reagan right after the funeral. Their bags were packed and hidden in her car. She'd arranged everything so that by the time I realized they were gone, she'd be in another state with paperwork filed, claiming I was an unfit parent due to grief and depression. I asked her how she could plan something so calculated while I was watching my mother die. Her answer was that she'd actually been trying to be considerate of my feelings by handling everything quietly so I wouldn't have to deal with a difficult divorce conversation on top of losing Mom. She genuinely seemed to believe she was being thoughtful by planning to kidnap our children during my mother's funeral. I canceled the apartment lease immediately and called my brother to come get the kids before the funeral. Told him exactly what was happening and asked him to keep them safe until I could figure out what to do legally. Cindy was furious that I'd ruined everything and kept insisting that her plan would have been less traumatic for everyone involved than a drawn-out custody battle. She said I was being selfish by forcing a confrontation when she'd found a solution that would let me grieve in peace. The funeral yesterday was a nightmare. I was trying to honor my mother while sitting next to someone who'd spent months planning to destroy what was left of my family the moment we got home. Every condolence, every hug, every person telling me how sorry they were for my loss. And the whole time I was thinking about how Cindy had scheduled moving trucks around my grief. We're sleeping in separate bedrooms now, and I've contacted a lawyer, filed emergency paperwork to prevent her from taking the kids out of state. The lawyer says what she planned probably wouldn't hold up legally, but it would have taken weeks or months to sort out, during which time the kids would have been traumatized and confused. Thomas keeps asking why they can't go visit Aunt Reagan like Mommy promised. Eden is old enough to sense something major is wrong, but not old enough to understand what. I don't know how to explain to them that their mother tried to use their grandmother's death as cover for kidnapping them. The part that keeps eating at me is how long she must have been planning this. Every time she encouraged me to spend extra time with Mom, every time she said she'd handle things at home so I could focus on the hospital visits, she was using my grief as camouflage for her exit strategy. I keep thinking about all the conversations we had about Mom's condition, about how hard it was to watch someone you love die slowly. Cindy would nod sympathetically and tell me she understood how difficult it must be. Meanwhile, she was scheduling apartment tours and researching custody laws. What kind of person does that? What kind of person uses their spouse's dying parent as an opportunity to plan a kidnapping? I don't even know if I'm more angry about the betrayal or the sheer coldness of the timing. She looked me in the eye every day for months while I was breaking down over losing Mom, and she was calculating exactly how to use my emotional state against me. The kids don't understand why Daddy and Mommy are fighting or why their surprise trip got canceled. Thomas asked me if it's because Grandma died, and I don't know how to explain that. It's because Mommy thought Grandma dying was the perfect time to take them away from me. I'm meeting with the lawyer again tomorrow to figure out next steps. Cindy keeps insisting she was trying to make things easier for everyone, that I'm overreacting to what was supposed to be a thoughtful solution to our marital problems. She still doesn't seem to understand that planning to disappear with our children during my mother's funeral isn't thoughtful. It's sociopathic. Update 1. It's been 2 weeks since my last post about discovering my wife's plan to disappear with our kids during my mother's funeral. I thought things couldn't get more messed up, but I was wrong. So wrong. First, thank you to everyone who commented on my original post. Reading your responses helped me realize I wasn't overreacting to what Cindy did. Some of you asked about the kids and the legal stuff. So, here's what's been happening. The emergency custody order went through, so Cindy can't take Thomas and Eden out of state without court approval. My lawyer said the judge was pretty disturbed by the timing of her planned departure. Apparently, scheduling a move during your spouse's parents' funeral raises some red flags about parental judgment. But that's where things started getting complicated. Cindy called her parents, Julian and Lena, the day after I filed the emergency order, and she gave them a very different version of events. According to her story, I've been emotionally distant for months. She was afraid I was having some kind of breakdown after Mom's death, and she was trying to protect the children from an unstable home environment. Julian called me 3 days ago demanding to know why I was using the legal system to trap his daughter in an abusive marriage. He said Cindy had told them I'd been neglecting the kids while spending all my time at the hospital, that I'd been drinking heavily since Mom got sick, and that she was worried about my mental state. I've known Julian for 15 years. This is a man who taught me how to change my car's oil, who helped me install our kitchen cabinets, who cried at our wedding, and he was talking to me like I was some kind of monster who beats his wife and terrorizes his children. The conversation was brutal. Julian kept demanding to know what I'd done to make Cindy so afraid that she felt like she had to flee the state. When I tried to explain about the secret planning and the timing around Mom's funeral, he said that sounded exactly like something an abusive husband would say to justify controlling behavior. He told me that Cindy had been calling them for months talking about how worried she was about my drinking and my anger issues. She'd apparently told them I'd been having violent outbursts and that she was scared to bring up divorce because she didn't know how I'd react. The drinking thing especially made me mad because it's complete garbage. Yeah, I had a few beers after particularly rough days at the hospital, but I wasn't drinking any more than usual. Certainly not enough to be considered a problem. But apparently Cindy had been building this narrative with her family for months. I asked Julian why, If all this was true, Cindy hadn't tried to get help or suggested counseling or done literally anything besides secretly planning to kidnap our children. His answer was that she'd been afraid to confront me directly because unpredictable men sometimes escalate when they feel cornered. When I pointed out that she'd managed to confront me just fine when her plan got discovered, he said that proved she'd been right to be scared because look how angry I got when she tried to leave safely. The circular logic was making me crazy. Everything I said to defend myself was being used as evidence that I was the kind of person who needed to be defended against. If I stayed calm, it meant I was manipulative. If I got frustrated, it meant I was volatile. There was literally no response that wouldn't confirm their existing opinion. Lena got on the phone toward the end of the conversation, and she was even worse. She told me that she'd always wondered about some of my behaviors, that she'd noticed how I like to be in control of family finances and decisions. She said Cindy had confided in her about feeling like she couldn't make choices without my approval. This was news to me because Cindy makes plenty of decisions without talking to me first. She bought a new car last year without even mentioning she was looking. She signed the kids up for activities, planned vacations, redecorated rooms. The idea that she was some kind of oppressed wife who couldn't make independent choices was insane. But Lena had specific examples ready. She mentioned the time 2 years ago when Cindy wanted to go back to work part-time, and I'd suggested waiting until Thomas was older. She brought up how I usually drive when we go places as a family. She even mentioned that I tend to order for the table when we go out to restaurants. All of these things were being reframed as evidence of controlling behavior. Never mind that Cindy and I had discussed her going back to work and mutually decided it made more sense to wait. Never mind that I drive because Cindy hates highway driving and asks me to. Never mind that I order for the table because I'm good at coordinating group orders and everyone appreciates not having to figure out what they want. Every normal married couple dynamic was being presented as proof that I was some kind of domestic tyrant. The worst part was that I could hear how it sounded from their perspective. If you already believe someone is controlling, then normal relationship behaviors start looking sinister. Cindy had apparently been poisoning the well for months, carefully building a case against me using perfectly innocent interactions. I tried to show them the calendar evidence, the apartment lease, the moving truck reservation, all timed around Mom's funeral. Julian said that timeline actually supported Cindy's story because it showed she was desperate enough to take drastic action, which meant she must have been really afraid of how I'd respond to a normal divorce conversation. When I asked why she'd tell the kids they were going on a fun trip to see Aunt Reagan instead of explaining that Mommy and Daddy were having problems, Lena said that was exactly what a protective mother should do to avoid traumatizing children during a dangerous situation. They turned everything upside down. The secret planning wasn't deceptive. It was protective. The timing wasn't cruel. It was strategic. The lies to the children weren't manipulation. They were age-appropriate crisis management. I hung up feeling like I was losing my mind. These are people who've known me for over a decade, who've watched me be a father and husband, who've seen how I interact with my family. But Cindy's version of events was so detailed and consistent that they were choosing to believe I'd been secretly abusive for years. The really sick part is that I started questioning myself. When someone you trust tells you that multiple people are saying you're controlling and volatile, you start wondering if you're missing something about your own behavior. Maybe I do make too many financial decisions. Maybe I am too quick to dismiss Cindy's ideas. Maybe there's a pattern I don't see. But then I talked to my brother, who knows our family better than anyone. He was furious when I told him what Julian and Lena had said. He pointed out that he's seen me and Cindy together at family gatherings for years, that he's watched how we parent the kids, that he's never seen anything remotely resembling the controlling behavior her parents were describing. He also reminded me that Cindy had never mentioned being unhappy with our marriage until literally the day I discovered her escape plan. No complaints about feeling controlled, no requests for more independence, no suggestions that we needed to work on our communication. If she'd been building resentment for months, she'd been hiding it completely. The conversation with my brother helped me realize what was happening. Cindy wasn't just trying to justify leaving. She was trying to rewrite our entire marriage history to make herself the victim and me the villain. She needed her family to believe she'd been trapped in an abusive situation because that was the only way her behavior looked reasonable instead of cruel. But the damage is spreading. Julian and Lena are now questioning everything about our relationship and demanding that Cindy fight for full custody. They're convinced she's married to a dangerous man who's using the legal system to prevent his victim from escaping. Meanwhile, Thomas keeps asking when he can go visit Grandma and Grandpa again, not understanding that they're not speaking to me anymore. Eden is old enough to sense the tension, but young enough to blame herself for all the adult drama happening around her. I'm meeting with my lawyer again tomorrow to discuss strategy. She's recommending a custody evaluator and possibly mediation, but she's also warning me that Cindy's narrative about abuse and control could complicate things significantly. Even though there's no evidence to support any of it, family court judges tend to err on the side of protecting children from potentially dangerous parents. The hardest part is that I can't even defend myself without sounding exactly like what an abusive husband would say. "I never hurt her and she's making it all up," are literally the most predictable responses from someone who actually is abusive. There's no way to prove a negative, especially when the accusations are about emotional patterns rather than specific incidents. Cindy seems to understand this perfectly. She's not accusing me of hitting her or threatening her. She's painting a picture of subtle control and emotional manipulation that's almost impossible to disprove. It's sophisticated in a way that makes me wonder how long she's been planning this whole narrative. What really gets me is that she's using my grief against me. Every day I spend at the hospital with my dying mother is being reframed as evidence that I was neglecting my family. Every difficult conversation we had about medical decisions or funeral arrangements is being presented as proof of my unstable emotional state. She's managed to turn the most painful experience of my life into ammunition for destroying our family. And she's doing it so skillfully that even people who love me are starting to doubt what they know about who I am. I don't know how to fight someone who's willing to lie this comprehensively about our entire relationship. Every memory, every interaction, every normal married couple moment is being weaponized against me. And the scarier part is that it's working. Update 2. It's been 3 weeks since my last update about Cindy trying to disappear with our kids during my mom's funeral. The custody evaluation is moving forward and her family is still convinced I'm some kind of abuser. But I finally found out what's actually been going on. And honestly, I wish I hadn't. So, remember how Cindy had been building this whole narrative with her parents about me being controlling and emotionally unstable? Well, it turns out that wasn't just preparation for her escape plan. She's been having an affair for the past 8 months. And she needed everyone to believe I was a terrible husband so that when she left me for another man, it would look like she was fleeing abuse rather than cheating. I found out completely by accident. Thomas had been asking to video chat with his cousin Jack, who's Reagan's son. Reagan is Cindy's sister who lives in the state where Cindy was planning to move. So, I set up a call between the boys, and Jack mentioned how excited he was that his new Uncle Neil was going to teach him to fish when Aunt Cindy and the kids moved there. Uncle Neil, not Uncle Thomas or Uncle Daddy's name, Uncle Neil. I asked Thomas to ask Jack more about Uncle Neil, trying to keep my tone casual. Turns out Uncle Neil has been living with Aunt Reagan for about 6 months now. He's really fun and brings the kids presents. Jack was looking forward to having more cousins to play with when Thomas and Eden moved there permanently. After the call, I confronted Cindy directly about Uncle Neil. Her face went completely white when I said the name. She tried to brush it off, saying Reagan had been dating someone named Neil, and the kids had gotten confused about the relationship, but I pressed her on it. I wanted to know why Jack thought Uncle Neil was specifically connected to our kids moving there. Why he'd mentioned that Uncle Neil had helped Aunt Reagan find a bigger apartment. Why Uncle Neil apparently knew specific details about Thomas's soccer team and Eden's school schedule. That's when Cindy broke down and admitted everything. Neil isn't just Reagan's boyfriend. He's Cindy's coworker from her old job, the one she quit 2 years ago when we decided she'd stay home with the kids. They'd reconnected on social media last year and had been having an emotional affair that turned physical around the time Mom's cancer got worse. The plan wasn't just for Cindy to disappear with the kids. Neil had already moved in with Reagan specifically to help facilitate Cindy's relocation. Reagan had gotten a bigger apartment to accommodate Cindy and the kids. Neil had researched schools and daycares. They'd been planning this whole new life together while I was watching my mother die. But here's the really twisted part. Cindy insisted that she wasn't leaving me for Neil. She was leaving me because our marriage was broken and Neil just happened to be there to help her through it. She kept saying that Neil was just a friend who understood what she was going through. That their relationship had developed naturally out of her need for emotional support during a difficult time. I asked her what difficult time she was referring to, since the only difficult thing happening in our lives was my mother's terminal illness. She said that watching me go through grief had made her realize how emotionally unavailable I'd always been. That she'd been feeling lonely and neglected for years. So, apparently, my grief over losing my mother had somehow made me a bad husband who deserved to be abandoned. The time I spent caring for a dying woman was evidence that I didn't care enough about my wife's emotional needs. I wanted to understand the timeline better, so I pushed for more details. Turns out, Cindy and Neil had been talking for months before they met up in person. Long text conversations about how unhappy she was in her marriage, how she felt trapped and unappreciated, phone calls that happened while I was at the hospital, where Neil would validate her feelings and tell her she deserved better. Neil had been the one to suggest that she should document my supposedly controlling behavior in case she needed it for custody proceedings. He'd helped her research divorce laws and custody arrangements. He'd even helped her figure out the timing for leaving, suggesting that doing it while I was grieving would make me less likely to fight her legally. The apartment hunting, the school research, the moving timeline. Neil had been involved in planning all of it. This wasn't just Cindy being cruel and calculated. This was two people working together to destroy my family while I was dealing with my mother's death. When I asked Cindy how she could do something so deliberately hurtful, she said that she'd been trying to find the kindest way to end our marriage under difficult circumstances. She genuinely seemed to believe that secretly planning to take my children while I buried my mother was somehow more considerate than having a direct conversation about marriage problems. She kept insisting that she'd never meant to hurt me, that she'd been trying to protect everyone involved by handling things quietly. The affair with Neil wasn't about wanting to hurt me. It was about finding someone who could give her the emotional support she wasn't getting at home. I asked her why she hadn't tried talking to me about feeling lonely or neglected before deciding to blow up our entire family. Her answer was that she tried to bring up relationship issues in the past, but I'd always been too busy or distracted to really listen. I challenged her on this because I couldn't remember any serious conversations about marriage problems. She gave me specific examples. Apparently, I dismissed her concerns about us not spending enough quality time together. I'd been resistant to her suggestions about date nights. I'd been focused on work and family obligations instead of our relationship. These were all news to me. I mean, we'd had normal married couple conversations about scheduling and priorities, but nothing that felt like serious relationship crisis discussions. But according to Cindy, my failure to recognize these conversations as cries for help had pushed her toward finding emotional connection elsewhere. The conversation went on for over 2 hours, with Cindy explaining how lonely and unimportant she'd been feeling and me trying to understand how that had led to planning my emotional destruction during my mother's funeral. She kept circling back to the idea that she'd been trying to handle things in the least harmful way possible. When I pointed out that secretly planning to disappear with our children was probably not the least harmful approach she could have taken, she said that a direct divorce conversation would have led to months of fighting and legal battles that would have been traumatic for the kids. She'd convinced herself that cleanly removing herself and the children from the situation while I was already dealing with grief would actually be less disruptive than a traditional divorce process. In her mind, I'd be too overwhelmed to fight her, so the transition would be smoother for everyone. The level of rationalization was incredible. Every cruel and manipulative thing she'd done had been reframed as thoughtful crisis management. The affair wasn't cheating. It was seeking necessary emotional support. The secret planning wasn't betrayal. It was protecting everyone from unnecessary conflict. Neil had apparently been very supportive of this whole framework. He'd helped her see that she was being emotionally abused by an unavailable husband, that her needs weren't being met, that she deserved to be with someone who truly appreciated her. I asked Cindy if Neil was married or had kids, wondering if he'd blown up his own family to be with her. Turns out Neil is divorced and has been for 3 years, which apparently made him an expert on recognizing unhealthy relationship patterns. According to Cindy, Neil had been through something similar with his ex-wife, a marriage where he felt unheard and unappreciated, where his emotional needs weren't being met. He'd helped Cindy realize that she was experiencing the same kind of relationship dynamics that had destroyed his first marriage. So Neil had basically projected his own failed marriage onto our situation and convinced Cindy that she was trapped in the same patterns that had made him unhappy. Instead of suggesting couples therapy or direct communication, he'd encouraged her to see our marriage as unfixable and plan her escape. The really messed up part is that Cindy still doesn't seem to understand what she did wrong. She keeps focusing on how unhappy she was, and how Neil helped her realize she deserved better. The timing, the deception, the impact on the kids, the fact that she was planning to destroy me while I grieved my mother. None of that seems to register as genuinely problematic behavior. She's painted herself as the victim of an emotionally unavailable husband who finally found someone who understood her pain. The affair is justified because I wasn't meeting her needs. The secret planning is justified because direct communication wouldn't have worked. The cruel timing is justified because there would never have been a good time to break up our family. I'm meeting with my lawyer tomorrow to discuss how this new information affects the custody case. The affair definitely changes things, especially since Neil was actively involved in planning the attempted disappearance with the kids. But I'm also trying to figure out how to explain all of this to Thomas and Eden without completely destroying their relationship with their mother. They don't need to know about the affair or the specific details of the planning, but they deserve to understand that Mommy wasn't fleeing from a dangerous situation. She was leaving to be with someone else. The hardest part is that I keep wondering if there were signs I missed. If Cindy really was unhappy and I just didn't notice. But then I remember that instead of talking to me about marriage problems, she talked to another man about them. Instead of suggesting counseling or working on our relationship, she planned to take my children and disappear. Even if our marriage wasn't perfect, even if I could have been a more attentive husband, nothing justified the cruelty of what she planned to do. Nothing justified using my mother's death as cover for destroying our family. Final update. It's been 2 months since my last update about discovering Cindy's affair with Neil and their plan to disappear with my kids during my mother's funeral. I wanted to give everyone who followed this mess a final update because the custody evaluation results are in and things have finally reached some kind of resolution. The custody evaluator's report was pretty damning for Cindy. Apparently planning to relocate children across state lines without the other parent's knowledge, especially during a family crisis, raises significant concerns about parental judgment and the ability to co-parent effectively. But what really sealed things was when the evaluator interviewed Thomas and Eden separately. Kids notice more than we think they do, and both of them had picked up on details about the planning that Cindy didn't realize they'd observed. Eden told the evaluator that Mommy had been packing their clothes in secret for weeks before Grandma's funeral, putting things in bags that she hid in the basement. Thomas mentioned that Mommy had been making lots of phone calls to Uncle Neil while Daddy was at the hospital, and that she'd told them they were going to start at a new school that would be much more fun than their current one. The evaluator also interviewed Reagan and Neil, which was where things got really interesting. Reagan apparently had no idea that Cindy was planning to leave without telling me. She thought we were getting divorced and that Cindy was moving out with the kids after everything was settled legally. When Reagan found out that Cindy had been planning to disappear with Thomas and Eden while I was at my mother's funeral, she was horrified. Neil, on the other hand, was completely aware of the timeline and had actively encouraged it. He told the evaluator that he'd advised Cindy to leave while my emotional state was compromised because it would give her the best chance of establishing residence in another state before I could legally challenge the move. The evaluator was not impressed with Neil's involvement in planning what essentially amounted to parental kidnapping. Her report specifically noted concerns about Cindy's judgment in taking relationship advice from someone who encouraged deceptive and potentially harmful actions regarding the children. But the real turning point came when Julian and Lena requested to speak with the evaluator directly. They'd been having doubts about Cindy's version of events ever since some of the timeline details started not making sense. Julian told me later that he'd started questioning things when he realized that all of Cindy's complaints about my supposedly controlling behavior had started right around the time she'd reconnected with Neil. Before that, she'd never mentioned feeling trapped or unhappy in our marriage during their regular phone calls. Lena had been bothered by the fact that Cindy couldn't provide specific examples of my alleged emotional abuse beyond normal married couple disagreements about scheduling and finances. When pressed for details, Cindy's stories kept changing or becoming more vague. The final straw was when they talked to Reagan directly and learned about the extent of Neil's involvement in the planning. Reagan told them that Neil had been researching divorce laws and custody procedures for months, that he'd helped Cindy practice what to say if I tried to fight the relocation, that he'd even suggested she should document instances of my supposedly volatile behavior to use in court. Julian and Lena realized that Cindy hadn't been fleeing from an abusive husband. She'd been planning to start a new life with her affair partner and had constructed an elaborate justification to make herself feel better about it. They called me to apologize, which was one of the most difficult conversations I've ever had. Julian was crying when he admitted that he'd believed Cindy's version of events because he couldn't imagine his daughter being capable of something so cruel and calculated. Lena said the hardest part was realizing that they'd attacked me for trying to protect my children from being taken away without warning, while supporting Cindy for planning something that would have traumatized Thomas and Eden. The custody arrangement that came out of all this gives me primary physical custody, with Cindy getting alternating weekends and one evening per week. She's also required to complete co-parenting classes and individual counseling before the arrangement can be modified. The judge was particularly concerned about the deception involved in the original plan and wanted to ensure that any future decisions about the children's living arrangements would be made transparently and in their best interests. Cindy was furious about the custody decision and tried to argue that it was punishment for her affair rather than a reflection of her parenting capabilities. But the evaluator's report made it clear that the concern wasn't about her relationship with Neil. It was about her willingness to make major decisions affecting the children without considering their father's rights or their own emotional well-being. The financial aspects of the divorce are still being worked out, but my lawyer expects things to be settled within the next few months. Cindy won't get the clean break she was planning when she thought she could disappear with the kids, but she'll get a fair division of our marital assets. Neil and Cindy are still together and they're planning to get married once our divorce is final. Reagan told Julian and Lena that she's concerned about their relationship dynamic because Neil seems to encourage Cindy's tendency to avoid difficult conversations and blame other people for problems that require her to take responsibility. But that's not my problem anymore. My focus is on helping Thomas and Eden adjust to our new normal and making sure they maintain a relationship with their mother despite everything that's happened. The kids are doing better than I expected. Eden understands more about what happened than Thomas does, but both of them seem relieved that there's no more uncertainty about where they'll be living or whether they'll have to change schools. Thomas still asks about Uncle Neil sometimes, but he's stopped asking when they're going to move to Aunt Reagan's house. Eden has been more direct about her feelings, telling me that she's glad she doesn't have to keep Mommy's secrets anymore. They spend their weekend visits with Cindy, and those seem to go okay most of the time. Cindy has been good about not discussing adult relationship issues with them or trying to justify her actions. I think she's finally starting to understand that her choices affected them, too. Not just me. My relationship with Julian and Lena is slowly rebuilding. They've been making an effort to spend time with Thomas and Eden, and they've been respectful about not pushing their own guilt about the situation onto the kids. Julian told me recently that he's been thinking a lot about how easy it was for him to believe that I was capable of emotional abuse, even though he'd never seen any evidence of it in 15 years of knowing me. He said it made him realize how dangerous it can be to accept someone's version of events without asking hard questions. For me, the hardest part of this whole experience has been accepting that Cindy genuinely believed her approach was reasonable. Even now, I don't think she fully understands why planning to disappear with our children during my mother's funeral was cruel rather than practical. She still frames the whole situation as a relationship that wasn't working out rather than a betrayal that involved months of deception and manipulation. In her mind, she was solving a problem efficiently rather than causing trauma that will affect our family for years. I've learned that some people are capable of convincing themselves that almost anything is justified if it gets them what they want. Cindy wanted a new life with Neil, and she was willing to construct whatever narrative made that feel acceptable, regardless of the impact on me or the kids. The good news is that Thomas and Eden are resilient, and they have a lot of people who love them and want what's best for them. We've all learned to communicate more directly about problems instead of letting things fester until they explode. I'm not dating anyone yet, but I'm not opposed to the idea eventually. This experience taught me a lot about red flags I missed the first time around and about the importance of being with someone whose approach to problem solving aligns with your own values. The divorce should be final within the next month, and then we can all move forward with clear boundaries and realistic expectations about what kind of relationship we can maintain as co-parents. I don't hate Cindy, which probably sounds strange given everything she did, but I understand now that we were never as compatible as I thought we were. I was married to someone who saw deception as a valid problem-solving strategy, and that's not something that can be fixed with better communication. The most important thing is that my kids are safe and stable, and they know that both of their parents love them, even though we can't be married to each other anymore. That's probably the best outcome we could have hoped for given how everything started. To everyone who commented on my previous posts with support and advice, thank you. Reading your responses helped me realize that I wasn't overreacting to what felt like a complete betrayal of trust, and that protecting my children from being taken without warning was the right thing to do regardless of how it affected my relationship with Cindy's family. The whole experience has been exhausting and heartbreaking. But it's also taught me that I'm stronger than I thought I was and that my kids are going to be okay even though their family doesn't look like what we all planned.